probably wouldn't be able to survive for very long because of all the people that would have a vested interest in exposing this.
Yes.
And getting the information out. And if we're...
You know, Greg, I could give you a quick example. The Nixon tape, there was a 20-minute gap.
Yeah.
How successful was Nixon and his administration in covering up that missing 20 minutes? 11 days. So with all the power of the executive branch behind them, they could only hide it for 11 days.
Yeah, so Watergate shows us that conspiracies are not very successful even at the highest levels.
No, and history, international politics shows us that as well. I don't want to belabor it, but the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939 was a secret cabal between two countries.
Right.
And it gets exposed very soon. Lenin's attempt to take over Russia gets exposed very soon. For any of these things to be successful, you have to let information out to those who can effectuate it. The problem is, as soon as that information gets out to someone, it gets exposed.
Well, then why is it, Dr. Clark, that these unjustified theories seem to have so much life to them?
Well, I think worldwide, there's been conspiracy theories all throughout human history. But in America, there's a particular kind of political culture that foments this, I think, even further. Since the Revolutionary War, we've divided our government into three competing agencies. And since Watergate, now we've had the Fourth Estate believes its job, the press believes its job is to check and find out what Hugh talked about earlier about Nixon's cover-up. To test the government, make sure it's telling the truth. And people born of that era, Chris Carter, the producer of the X-Files, talks about that and says, I was born of the Watergate era, and so he distrusts government.
So it's almost part of the national consciousness now to believe conspiracy theories because of recent historical events that have fed into this
JFK assassination, World War II, and all that.
No, that's true of other nations as well.
Yes.
Russia's a prime example where their past history feeds into this mentality that there must be a gigantic government cover-up of UFOs.
Sure.
Dr. Ross, we want to draw on your expertise now as an astronomer, and we'd like you to comment on some recent NASA footage that has captured what seems to be some pretty strong evidence that lends credibility to the idea that ships are hovering over the Earth here in our atmosphere. Our viewers may be familiar with this incident, they're called tether incident actually, where NASA astronauts lost a gas-filled tether floating off in space, and the cameras are recording this, and then it seems like a team of about 50 UFOs begin to hover around this tether, examining it, whatever. That's the way it appears. And we're going to take a moment and we'll see the video clip here, and I'll let you respond to it.
Okay. Now this rod that you see here is the tether of the spacecraft, and you can see that there are some objects, particularly here. There's a bunch of little objects that seem to be clustering around the tether. There's a spheroid there, kind of looks like an amoeba.
It looks like a parachute or a jellyfish or something.
And so you see this stuff streaming by. This seems to be making an approach, different directions, but notice that it's all spherical type shapes. And this would be typical if there's some kind of gas or fluid release. And after all, this was a broken tether, and the tether was filled with gases and fluids. There's even an incident where the astronauts released some urine into outer space. You can get a similar thing.
You get a similar effect from water, any kind of water or liquids being...
In the vacuum of outer space, you're going to get all these little spheroids.
So what you're saying, Dr. Ross, is that chances are this is going to turn out to be an IFO, an identified flying object.
Well, it's at least an identifiable flying object. There's a possibility that we can identify everything we saw here in this clip with something that would be natural or man-originated.
Okay, well, there's another NASA clip that doesn't look like it performs in a way that's man-made. Let's take a look at that clip.
Sure. Yes, you see this object taking a right-angled turn or a near right-angled turn. Notice the second one doesn't do that. But hey, if you take a second look at this, you can see that just where that right-angled turn is occurring, the whole planet Earth shifts. So clearly this is a camera movement, not the actual...
That's what I was going to ask you, because I know in high-altitude reconnaissance, when NEMA, National Imaging and Mapping Agency, looks at things, they have to take into account the angle that they take the picture from, the shadow cast and all that. But if you have a camera moving, at the time of it. It's going to cause a physical, an apparent change.
Right.
Well, is that what you're? That's
yeah,
what it looked
and
like.
Obviously,
in this.
the camera moved because you got the whole planet Earth shifting over. And
yeah, it was rotating real fast, and all of a sudden it stopped. And then the second one shows it, and it doesn't make that
when
move.
the second one comes, you don't see that.
In other
right
words,
angle.
this right angle movement that the first object appears to make is perfectly timed with the change in that that aspect of the Earth we see in the photo. So there could be an explanation here that there's a distortion of some sort that we see in the Earth, and also therefore is affecting the way that first object looks, and the second one doesn't have such distortion, and that's why we see a more understandable trail there.
Yeah, and both of these clips demonstrate that the UFO investigator must be aware of the environment, of the situation, and also must be aware of what was responsible for taking the image. Every camera, whether it be optical or radar or whatever, is going to have ghost images in it. And so you have to be able to deal with that as well. But in showing these clips, we're not saying that there isn't evidence for sharp right angle turns. I mean, there are clear examples where you see these fast-moving flying objects making very sudden stops or starts or right-angle turns. And these would be the rUFOs, those that would not be identifiable with natural or man-made phenomena. But this is a case where people thought they were rUFOs.
So this is one of those, arguably, one of those 95 to 98% of the cases where we have an odd phenomenon that actually does have a legitimate explanation. Though, as you pointed out, there still are those rUFOs, those residual UFO sightings that do this kind of thing, and they can't be accounted for by camera movement or something like that.
Some people would classify what we saw here as an rUFO, but the authors of this book, myself included, would not. I mean, we take a much more restrictive,
more skeptical, in a sense, properly skeptical approach. Well, let's sum up our response so far to this second hypothesis, the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And it seems you've outlined three different problems that we have with this. The first one is that the chances of finding any planet capable of supporting extraterrestrial life, that in itself is a problem, okay? Can there be extraterrestrial life out there? The second problem, if there is extraterrestrial life, how is it going to get here? And then we talked about the problems with space travel and the like. And the third thing has to do with government conspiracies. And Dr. Clark, you pointed out that all this government conspiracy response has some serious problems, and a lot of things, when you look at it now with hindsight and declassification, those things can be resolved.
Correct.
But the fact remains, of course, that we have some credible evidence for these rUFOs. They do in fact exist, and that perhaps a third explanation will work to answer all of the facts.
or even an adjustment of that third explanation.
Okay. Well, this explanation has to somehow account for the fact that these rUFOs are real, but also that they exhibit some of the non-physical properties that we talked about in the first episode.
Correct.
And Hugh, this brings us to the topic of our final segment together. In that segment, we'll explore the third hypothesis to explain these residual UFOs. It's called the extra-dimensional hypothesis. Could these rUFOs be visitors from another dimension? Do these alien beings want to help us discover the meaning of life and bring peace on Earth? Do they possess a higher wisdom? We'll explore these questions and more next time. Thank you for joining us.
September 20th, 1961. a couple was driving alone through the White Mountains of New Hampshire. They witnessed a large, pancake-shaped craft flying towards them. Once home, they were unable to account for